The Jeff Younger Show is on, dedicated to my sons, James and Jude.
Here's a question that will change how you see the world. If the wise and virtuous should rule, and of course they should, why don't they? The answer is not corruption. It's not conspiracy. It's something much more fundamental. Wisdom and virtue are real. They're definitely essential for good rule, but they're invisible. You can't see them from the outside. And the people who most need to recognize excellence are the least equipped to identify it. And this is the problem of invisibility. And it explains why every actual government and company rests on convention and myth. So let's start with what ought to be true. Human beings are not all the same. They're not all equal in capacity. They're not all fit for the same work. Some people are a lot more wise and virtuous than other people, and these individuals are the natural rulers because only they could rule well, justly, wisely. I'm not being an aristocratic snob here. It's just a simple observation. Good decisions require judgment, experience, knowledge of particulars. Previous video was about practical wisdom. We need people with an ordered character and practical wisdom. And not everyone has these in equal measure. In fact, most people don't have them at all. So, rational rule is ruled by the rational. The principle is obvious. The wise and virtuous should govern, and the foolish and vicious should not govern. If this principle operated directly, how simple would political life be? We just identify the excellent, put them in charge, and then just watch the country or your company or your city or your state, it would just flourish. But it just doesn't operate directly, and it can't. This is a realist show, so we're going to look at how it really works. Here's the fundamental defect in the human condition that wrecks this best will rule. First of all, wisdom and virtue are genuine, objective qualities. I'm not dissing virtue and wisdom. The problem is that they're just not externally visible. They're not obvious to others. And they're especially not obvious to those who lack wisdom and lack virtue, who most need to recognize and defer to them. This is what I call the problem of invisibility. Think about what it would require to recognize true wisdom. I'm talking about practical wisdom. You have to be able to evaluate the quality of someone's judgment. But to evaluate someone's judgment, you would need to be able to judge what they judged. In other words, to judge judgment, you got to have judgment. The man who lacks practical wisdom just can't reliably identify it in other people. He doesn't know what he's looking at. He doesn't know what he's looking for. He doesn't even know, in many cases, what he should be looking for. And the same applies to virtue. And in this case, I'm talking about character virtues. The vicious man will mistake his own corruption for sophistication. We've all seen people like this. He sees genuine virtue and he thinks it's naive. I used to work for a guy named Walter, sales guy, and I worked with him, and he was a very vicious, conniving person. And he always understood that as a fault in other people because they were just being naive. He can't recognize what he himself doesn't possess, which is a conscience. So the principle that the wise and virtuous should rule produces in practice a chaotic free-for-all. Every possessor and pretender to excellence advances his claim. The genuinely excellent can't prove their excellence to those who are not equipped to perceive it. So the frauds and flatterers sound just as convincing and more convincing because they optimize for sounding convincing than for being right. If only nature were better arranged, if only internal character traits were correlated with some clear, easily measured external sign, that would just solve so many problems. The rights of wisdom and virtue would have direct effect in the world. But again, this is a realist show. That's just not the case. Nature is not arranged that way. Internal excellence has no reliable external marker. And so the only fully rational ground for ruling or managing a company, ruling a city, ruling a state, it's just politically unusable. If the rational principle of rule can't operate directly, then, well, what actually takes its place? I'm just going to tell you the facts. Convention and myth. If you look at virtually all traditional societies, the government's claim to authority was based on some story that had nothing to do with wisdom or virtue. The rulers are looked upon as a golden race, literally made of superior material when the gods fashioned humanity, or they're of superior blood, a noble lineage stretching back to heroes or divinities, or they're descendants of the gods themselves, or they're anointed by some divine right, chosen by heaven to rule over ordinary men. Plato calls this the noble lie. It can't rest on rationality and truth alone. So the uncomfortable fact that we have to face is that politics requires illusion. Consider the following. Before anyone will obey, they have to believe the rulers have the right to command. But the true ground of that wisdom and virtue, that's the true ground of the right to rule. It's invisible. So some visible substitute has to be invented. Blood you can trace, divine appointment that you can ritualize, gold that you can mix into the story of origin. In the case of the American founders, it's a kind of founding myth about the superiority of the founders and their extreme exceptionalism. These are visible markers, transmissible, and they give people something to point to. They settle the question of who rules without requiring the impossible, that the unwise recognize wisdom. That just can't happen. The noble lie exists because it serves order. And without it, you get endless contestation, even civil war. You get the strong just simply dominating the weak with no pretense of legitimacy at all. You may think this is ancient history. Divine right, golden races, we're past that. Well, I don't think we're past it. I think we've just changed the myths. Modern legitimacy rests on credentials, processes, elections, and these are all fictions. They're just noble lies. The credential says that this person passed through certain institutions, accumulated certain markers, was approved by certain gatekeepers, therefore they must be qualified. But the credential measures exposure to information. It doesn't measure wisdom. We talked about this in the video on practical wisdom. In fact, the educational institutions prohibit the development of practical wisdom. A man with the degree can be an absolute fool, and we've all met such people. The man without a degree can be the wisest man in the room. The credential is a visible marker substituting for an invisible quality, just like the golden race, just like divine, just like these other myths. The decision was made according to the proper procedure. Committees reviewed it, stakeholders were consulted, forms were signed, therefore it is legitimate. This is what you hear a lot of constitutionalists say. This election happened according to the rules, or this trial happened according to the rules, so the outcome must be just. And indeed, in America, the American notion of justice is purely procedural. When an appellate court reviews the justness of a decision of a lower court, it only looks to see that the procedures were followed. The outcomes that happen to the litigants in the court don't even matter to whether it's considered just in our legal system. That's pure process mythology happening right there. The process measures compliance with a ritual. It doesn't measure whether the decision was actually wise. The worst decisions in history followed proper procedure. And I'm on YouTube and I can't talk about what some of those might be, but you can use your limited knowledge of history to think of some. The process is a visible performance that substitutes for an invisible judgment. Elections, which are in the modern liberal world are the way we give legitimacy to rulers, says that this person won the most votes, therefore they have the right to rule. But what does a vote actually measure? It just measures popularity with the unwise. It measures popularity with the same people who can't recognize wisdom in a private conversation are not going to recognize it on a ballot. Democracy solves the legitimacy problem by giving everyone a say, but it doesn't solve the competence problem. It buries it under a different myth. It basically says popularity implies divine right. I think that's a very stupid myth. It's a more stupid myth than the divine right myth itself, in my opinion. Now, look, none of this means that credentials, processes, and elections are worthless. I'm not saying that. I am saying that they constrain abuses, they provide peaceful transitions, they create accountability structures. But I'm also saying they do not produce rule by the wise. And they can't, because the problem of invisibility remains no matter what credential or process or election you hold. Now, again, this is a realist show, so we got to get practical. What can you do with this knowledge? Well, first of all, stop expecting rational rule. It ain't coming. The problem of invisibility guarantees that the people in charge will be selected by criteria that have little to do with wisdom or virtue. You're going to be ruled by your inferiors. You just have to get used to that. Second, learn to see through the myths. You can sometimes find a local advantage that you can use that can have a big difference in your life. Every institution has a legitimacy story. Identify it. Ask, what's the visible marker substituting for the invisible quality? And once you see the structure, you'll understand what the institution actually rewards. And it's rarely what the myth claims. Third, recognize that you are part of the problem. Your ability to identify wisdom in others is limited by your own wisdom. The more you develop judgment, the better you'll be at recognizing it. The practically wise automatically seek out the practically wise. They cling together because there's not many of them. And in fact, the practically wise often ostracize themselves from the unwashed masses who lack practical wisdom. They find each other somehow. Practically wise people find each other. And they do it even in a world of myths and conventions. And they can have the conversations that the unwashed masses lacking virtue and wisdom can't have. Fourth, just try to understand why this matters. If you ever find yourself in a position to select leaders, whether you're hiring, you're promoting, you're voting people, whether you should work on a campaign or not, whether you should run for office or not, even when you evaluate yourself, you're faced with the problem of invisibility directly. So credentials aren't going to save you. Processes won't save you. You have to develop the judgment to see what's easily seen. And there's no system that's going to substitute for your own discernment. Let me just clear that up. No AI, no process that you create is ever going to substitute for your own personal discernment. Fifth, lower your political expectations, but raise your personal ones. The city will never be ruled by the wise. You will be ruled by your inferiors. That's not cynicism, it's the structure of the problem. But your own life can be governed by something closer to wisdom. You can develop judgment. Go look at my previous video on practical wisdom on how you can develop practical wisdom and good judgment. It's not something that can be imparted in a book, but I can tell you the way you acquire it. And it's a long, hard road, but you can acquire it. You can learn to recognize excellence in other people. You can stop being the asshole who hates excellence in other people and learns to admire it in other people. And you can build relationships with enterprises and people where competence actually exists. You can't fix the world, but you can become someone whose vision penetrates the fog in your own life. The problem of invisibility is why the best rarely rule. I would say the best cannot rule. Wisdom and virtue are real things. I'm not denigrating them, but they cannot be seen, especially by those who lack them. So every actual authority rests on a convention and myth, golden races, divine right, credentials, processes, elections, a belief in a kind of intellectual superiority. It all rests on this because the unwise masses need that in order to confer legitimacy onto the rulers. And even if you have unwise rulers, you often still have stability. And that's something that's been rare throughout history. The myths are going to change. The kinds of myths we tell ourselves are going to change to confer this justification onto unwise rulers. The problem will never change. It's embedded in human nature. Your job is to see clearly anyway. Your job is to develop judgment. Again, go view my video on practical wisdom and what it's going to require of you to develop good judgment. Learn to recognize excellence. Learn to admire it, not hate it. And don't expect the system to do this for you. You have to do it for yourself. The future is going to belong to men who see clearly and act accordingly. It's not necessarily going to belong to men who rule. That's what I have to say today. Get off the internet, think about what we've said, and go do something.
The Jeff Younger Show, signing off.